What if the world had lost to Hitler? What if he had achieved his ultimate goal, global domination? Thunder rumbles in the distance. A black and white newspaper spins onto the screen. Allied forces surrender. Hitler declares global rule. The screen turns red as the Nazi flag unfurls, covering the entire planet. This isn't just another history lesson. This isn't the world you know. This is history rewritten. Imagine waking up in a world where there is no freedom, no democracy, and no place to run. Where the swastika isn't just a symbol of the past. It's everywhere. On every building, on every uniform, on every television screen. Where your thoughts are not your own, and every word you speak is monitored. This is not just another dictatorship. If you think Hitler's reign would have been just another government ruling with an iron fist, think again. This world is far darker than you could ever imagine. Flash forward to a chilling glimpse of a dystopian future. Crowds marching in robotic unison, massive Nazi rallies stretching for miles, and children in uniforms pledging allegiance to the Führer. The world is no longer divided by nations. No more America. No more Britain. No more Russia. There is only one empire, one ruler, and one ideology. Show an image of a massive globe, covered in red, with a giant swastika imprinted over it. Everything you love, your music, your movies, your books, your culture, has been erased, rewritten, or banned. Individuality? Non-existent. Your race? Your identity? It only matters if you fit their definition of perfect. If not, you don't belong. And in this world, if you don't belong, you don't exist. But how did this happen? How did Hitler win World War II? And if he did, what kind of terrifying world will we be living in today? Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to see is not just an alternate history. It's a nightmare brought to life. Flashes of brutal police patrols, towering statues of Hitler, and public executions fill the screen. Are you ready to step into a world that almost became reality? Dramatic pause. The screen fades to black. A heartbeat sound plays as the next chapter begins. World War II did not end the way we know it. Instead of Hitler's defeat, the tides of war turned in his favor, and the world witnessed the complete collapse of democracy. The Axis powers emerged victorious, and the Nazi regime established its dominance across the globe. But how did this happen? What key events led to Hitler's ultimate victory? The turning point in this alternate timeline came in 1940, when the Battle of Britain took a disastrous turn for the Allies. The relentless German Luftwaffe launched a new wave of bombings, overwhelming Britain's air defenses. London, Birmingham, and Manchester were reduced to rubble. Winston Churchill, a symbol of British resistance, was assassinated in a covert Nazi operation, throwing Britain into chaos. Without its strong leadership, Britain surrendered in 1941, signing a humiliating peace treaty that placed it under full German occupation. Meanwhile, Hitler executed Operation Barbarossa with precision, learning from his past mistakes. This time, he did not underestimate the Russian winter. Instead of launching a single massive invasion, he strategically divided his forces, focusing first on the oil-rich Caucasus region. The Soviet Union, cut off from vital resources, began to collapse. Stalin, desperate to hold on to power, faced multiple military coups from within. By 1943, Moscow had fallen, and the swastika was raised over the Kremlin. With Britain and the Soviet Union out of the war, the Nazis controlled all of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. The once mighty Allied forces were scattered and leaderless. Across the Atlantic, the United States had remained a beacon of hope for the free world. But in this timeline, Hitler's secret weapon changed everything. In 1942, Nazi Germany completed the development of its own atomic bomb, years ahead of the United States. With this technological advantage, Hitler ordered a surprise attack on New York City and Washington, D.C. 2 atomic bombs were dropped, turning these cities into nuclear wastelands. The American government was thrown into disarray. The president and key officials were forced into hiding, and without strong leadership, the country began to fracture. Taking advantage of the chaos, Germany launched Operation Sea Serpent, a massive invasion of the U.S. East Coast. Nazi U-boats and aircraft carriers surrounded American waters, cutting off supply routes. German forces, supported by Japanese allies attacking from the Pacific, stormed American soil. By 1945, the White House was seized and the Nazi flag flew over Washington, D.C. The United States, once a superpower, had fallen. While Hitler dominated Europe and America, Japan had its own conquests. The Empire of Japan, emboldened by Germany's victories, launched full-scale invasions across Asia. China, India, and Australia were all brought under Axis rule. The world had been split between two dominant forces, Germany controlling the West and Japan ruling the East. The United Nations never came into existence. There was no Cold War. There was no resistance left strong enough to fight back. By 1950, Hitler had achieved what he always dreamed of, a world completely under his control. With every government either destroyed or absorbed into the Nazi regime, democracy ceased to exist. There were no more elections, no free speech, no human rights. The world was ruled under the iron fist of a single dictator. The last remnants of resistance were hunted down and eliminated. Underground movements in South America, Africa, and hidden pockets of Asia tried to resist, but they were crushed by advanced Nazi surveillance technology and brutal military forces. No rebellion could stand against Hitler's global empire. The world had changed forever. Freedom was now a distant memory. A new era had begun, one where only those who fit Hitler's vision of a perfect society were allowed to exist. But what did this world look like? How did everyday life function under the rule of the Third Reich? This is where the nightmare truly begins. After Hitler's victory, the world did not remain the same. The old world order, democracies, independent nations, and free societies was erased. In its place rose the global Nazi Empire, a brutal, all-powerful regime that ruled over every continent. No government existed outside of Hitler's rule. No law was passed without his approval. Every decision, every policy, every action taken by the world was dictated by the Führer himself. The new world order had no presidents, no prime ministers, no parliaments, and no elections. Hitler was the undisputed ruler of the entire planet. His word was law, and his ideology became the foundation upon which society was built. His rule was permanent. There would be no successors, no opposition, no transfer of power. Governments that once stood independently were abolished. The world was divided into districts, each controlled by Nazi governors handpicked by Hitler himself. The United States became the American Reich. The Soviet Union was dismantled and renamed Germania East. Britain, France, China, and all other former nations were dissolved into Nazi-controlled provinces. Local cultures, languages, and histories were erased. Everything was rewritten to fit the Nazi ideology. All laws were dictated from Berlin, the capital of the world. Hitler's advisors, including Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring, managed different aspects of the empire, but no one held authority above Hitler. His rule was absolute and eternal. Though Hitler maintained full control, he delegated regional rule to his most trusted generals. Each major continent was overseen by a Nazi commander, responsible for enforcing Hitler's laws, crushing resistance, and ensuring absolute loyalty. Europe, ruled directly from Berlin, this was the heart of the empire, where only pure Germans were allowed to live. Every other ethnicity was enslaved or exterminated. North America, once a thriving land of democracy, it became a militarized zone, ruled with an iron fist. English was banned, replaced by German as the official language. South America, used for resource extraction and labor camps, anyone living here was seen as expendable. The people worked under brutal conditions to fuel the Nazi war machine. Africa, entire populations were wiped out or enslaved to build cities, highways, and factories for the empire. The natural wealth of Africa was exploited without mercy. Asia, under a strict racial hierarchy, Japanese allies controlled parts of Asia, but ultimate power remained with Hitler. China and India were reduced to labor states, feeding the Nazi war industry. Australia, its population was relocated or exterminated. The land was used as a massive military testing ground. Each of these territories operated under one principle: total obedience to Hitler. Any sign of defiance was met with swift and brutal punishment. The only truth allowed was the one dictated by Hitler's regime. Every form of media, education, and communication was controlled. Schools taught Nazi ideology from an early age, ensuring that no child ever questioned Hitler's rule. Textbooks were rewritten, history was altered, and science was manipulated to support Nazi beliefs. The media played a crucial role in maintaining absolute control. Newspapers, radios, films, and television programs were all produced under strict Nazi supervision. Every morning, citizens were required to listen to government broadcasts that reinforced loyalty to the regime. Books that contradicted Nazi ideology were banned and burned. There was no freedom of speech, no art, no independent journalism. Anyone caught spreading false information was immediately arrested or worse. In Hitler's world, no one was ever alone. Every home, workplace, and public space was monitored by the government. Advanced surveillance technology, developed years ahead of its time, kept track of every citizen's movements. Cameras were installed in every street, every building, and even inside homes. Radio signals tracked conversations. Secret police forces patrolled every neighborhood, searching for signs of disloyalty. Speaking against the government, even in private, was a death sentence. People were encouraged to report their own family members for thought crimes. Spies were everywhere. No one could be trusted. The Gestapo and SS officers were given unlimited authority to detain, interrogate, and execute anyone suspected of resistance. There were no courts, no trials, no appeals. Justice was swift, brutal, and final. Any form of rebellion, protest, or resistance was crushed immediately. The world had no place for dissenters. Those who spoke out disappeared overnight. Entire families were arrested, tortured, and executed as warnings to others. Prisons were overflowing with political prisoners, but most were sent to massive concentration camps, now expanded across the entire world. These camps were no longer hidden. They were openly used as examples of what happened to those who defied the regime. Rebel groups still existed in secret, operating in the darkest corners of the world, but their fight was hopeless. With advanced military technology, limitless resources, and global surveillance, Hitler's rule was unbreakable. This was the new world order, a world where there was no escape. Every aspect of life was controlled by a single man, and every citizen was nothing more than a tool in his vision of a perfect society. There was no freedom, no individuality, and no future beyond what Hitler dictated. But what was daily life like for the people trapped in this dystopian nightmare? What did ordinary citizens experience under Hitler's iron rule? The answers will shock you. After Hitler achieved total world domination, life changed forever. The world was no longer a collection of diverse cultures, beliefs, and freedoms. Every aspect of life, education, work, family, and personal choices, was controlled by the Nazi regime. There was no room for individuality, no personal ambitions outside of serving the empire, and no concept of human rights. The new world followed only one rule: absolute obedience to Hitler. Education was no longer about learning science, art, literature, or independent thought. Schools became indoctrination centers, designed to create loyal, obedient subjects of the Nazi Empire. From the moment children could speak, they were taught that Hitler was their supreme leader and that the Nazi ideology was the ultimate truth. All history books were rewritten. There was no mention of past democracies, revolutions, or freedom movements. The only history that mattered was Nazi history. Mathematics, science, and geography were redesigned to serve Nazi propaganda. Students learned about racial superiority and how the Aryan race was destined to rule the world. Philosophy and free thinking were banned. Questioning the government was the greatest crime. Critical thinking was erased from society. Every school day began with a pledge to Hitler. Children were required to salute his portrait, sing Nazi anthems, and recite propaganda slogans. Young boys were trained from an early age to become soldiers. Physical education was no longer about fitness. It was military training. They learned how to shoot, march, and fight for the Führer. By the age of 16, every boy was drafted into the Nazi army. Young girls were taught how to serve men, raise children, and obey the state. Their future was decided for them, to become mothers of the empire and produce the next generation of soldiers. Not everyone was allowed to have a job of their choosing. In Hitler's world, professions were assigned based on how well they served the Nazi Empire. The government decided what skills were needed, and people were forced into careers that supported the regime. Scientists worked only for military and racial research. There were no independent discoveries, no space exploration, and no technological advancements unless they benefited the war machine. Doctors and medical professionals were used for experiments and genetic purification. The weak, sick, and disabled were eliminated, ensuring a stronger Aryan population. Farmers were forced to produce food for the military. There was no private farming. Everything belonged to the government. Artists, musicians, and writers were banned unless they promoted Nazi ideals. Jazz, blues, and any form of art from other cultures were outlawed. Workers in factories labored under brutal conditions, producing endless supplies of weapons, vehicles, and military equipment. There were no unions, no wages, no rights. Only service to the empire. Professions that did not align with Nazi goals were eliminated. Philosophy, independent journalism, psychology, and creative arts were wiped out. There was no need for thinkers, only workers and soldiers. The world under Hitler followed a strict racial and social hierarchy. Only those of pure Aryan blood were allowed to live privileged lives. Everyone else was either a second-class citizen, a laborer, or a disposable slave. The social hierarchy. The Führer Hitler, supreme ruler, worshipped like a god. Nazi high command, generals, SS officers, and elite government officials. Pure Aryans, privileged citizens with access to luxury, education, and power. Loyal non-Aryans, limited rights but allowed to work in service roles. Forced laborers, people from occupied territories forced to work without rights. The unworthy, anyone considered weak, disabled, rebellious, or racially impure was executed. In this world, social mobility was impossible. No matter how hard someone worked, they could never rise above the rank assigned to them by their birth. If you were not born an elite Aryan, you were doomed to serve forever. One of Hitler's first global policies was a complete destruction of non-German cultures. Every nation that was conquered had its history, traditions, and identity erased. Languages other than German were outlawed. English, Spanish, Russian, French, and Chinese were wiped out. Schools and businesses only operated in German. Religions were banned. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples were destroyed. The only accepted belief was worship of the Nazi state. Music, films, and books from other cultures were burned. Only state-approved Nazi literature and music were allowed. Architecture was redesigned to reflect Nazi power. Ancient landmarks and historical buildings were demolished and replaced with massive statues of Hitler and Nazi symbols. Women had only one purpose: to bear children for the empire. Their lives were strictly controlled by the government. Women were not allowed to work outside the home. Their only job was to marry and produce children. Arranged marriages were common. The government chose husbands for women based on racial purity. Women had no rights over their bodies. They were forced to have as many children as possible. Birth control and abortion were illegal. Education for women was minimal. They were only taught how to take care of a home and serve their husbands. Women who refused to follow these rules were sent to re-education camps or executed. In Hitler's world, women were nothing more than tools for population growth. Families were no longer private. Every household was monitored by the government. Parents had no authority over their children. Hitler did. Children were taken from families at a young age and placed in Nazi training camps to ensure total loyalty to the state. Marriages were arranged by the government. Love and personal choice no longer existed. Any family member who spoke against the regime was reported, even by their own children. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on each other. One wrong word could lead to an entire family's execution. Family life was cold, strict, and based on obedience. There was no warmth, no love, only duty to the empire. In Hitler's world, there was no happiness, no dreams, and no individuality. Every human being was just a piece of the Nazi machine, working, serving, and dying for the state. But what about those who refused to obey? What happened to the rebels, the outcasts, and the ones who dared to fight back? The answer is even darker than you imagine. In a world where Hitler reigned supreme, technology and science would have been shaped entirely by Nazi ideology. Scientific progress would no longer be driven by curiosity, innovation, or the betterment of humanity. Instead, every discovery and invention would serve military dominance, racial purity, and absolute control. This world would not be one of technological enlightenment, but of war machines, genetic experiments, and brutal suppression of free thought. Let's dive into what science and technology would look like under Nazi rule. Under Hitler's rule, science was never about making life better. It was about making war machines more powerful. Every technological breakthrough would have been weaponized to ensure that no rebellion could ever rise against the empire. Superweapons program. The Nazis were already developing massive wonder weapons during World War II. With unlimited resources, they would have created gigantic tanks, laser-based weapons, and nuclear-powered aircraft, supersonic fighter jets. The Nazis pioneered jet technology in World War II. If they had won, they would have likely developed hypersonic fighter jets capable of reaching any part of the world within hours. Nuclear domination. The atomic bomb was already in development by Nazi scientists. In this alternate world, Hitler would have thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at every continent. Any resistance would be wiped out instantly. AI for surveillance and control. Although artificial intelligence didn't exist in the 1940s, a Nazi-controlled future would have developed AI-powered surveillance drones, robotic enforcers, and automatic propaganda systems to keep the population in check. The world would not be a place of technological advancement for the good of humanity. It would be a giant war machine, constantly prepared for the next conquest. Under Hitler's rule, space exploration would have been entirely militarized and racially driven. Instead of peaceful scientific discovery, space travel would have been a quest for Aryan domination of the cosmos. The Nazi moon base. The Third Reich was already experimenting with advanced rocket technology, including the V-2 rocket. In this world, Nazi Germany would have reached the moon first and established a lunar military base to launch future invasions. Mars colonization. A new Aryan world. With unlimited power, Nazi scientists would have eventually aimed for Mars, creating a perfect Aryan colony where only racially pure individuals could live. Weaponized space stations. Instead of satellites for communication and science, Hitler's world would have orbital laser stations, space-based missile launchers, and planetary surveillance platforms to keep Earth under constant control. No international cooperation. In our real world, space exploration has been a joint effort between many nations. Under Nazi rule, there would be no alliances, no shared knowledge, only totalitarian space conquest. The universe would not be a place of discovery, but an extension of Nazi control, ensuring their ideology spread beyond Earth. One of the darkest aspects of Nazi rule would be their continued use of human experimentation. The Nazis had already conducted horrific medical tests in concentration camps. If they had won, this cruelty would have expanded globally. Mass sterilization and eugenics. To ensure the purity of the Aryan race, mass sterilization programs would have been forced upon undesirable populations. Millions of people would be unable to reproduce, leading to the slow extermination of non-Aryans. Experimenting on the weak. Instead of treating diseases, Nazi doctors would have used prisoners, disabled individuals, and inferior races as test subjects. Cybernetic enhancements. The creation of Nazi super soldiers. With technological advancement, human experiments would have shifted toward creating genetically modified, technologically enhanced perfect soldiers. These soldiers would feel no pain, no fear, and would be programmed for absolute obedience. Mass human cloning. The Nazis had a strong interest in genetics. With time, they would have developed cloning technology to mass-produce perfect Aryan warriors and workers. Science in this world would not be about saving lives. It would be a tool for mass control, genetic cleansing, and military dominance. In a Nazi-controlled world, genetic science would have been used not for curing diseases, but for creating the perfect human race. Every person would be subject to forced genetic screening, and those deemed impure would be eliminated. DNA testing for purity. Every child would be genetically tested. Those who did not meet Aryan standards would be sterilized, exiled, or executed. Selective breeding programs. The Nazis would have forced ideal Aryan couples to reproduce under government control, ensuring each new generation was genetically superior. Elimination of genetic disorders. While modern science seeks to cure genetic diseases, Nazi science would eliminate anyone who had them. Human enhancement programs. Scientists would experiment with modifying genes to increase strength, intelligence, and obedience. The goal? A race of physically perfect, mentally controlled superhumans. Under the system, humanity would no longer be diverse. Every person would be a government-designed product, created only to serve the empire. While technology would have advanced in some areas, true scientific progress would have been severely limited. Any discovery that did not align with Nazi ideology would be destroyed. Banning of Jewish science. The Nazis already rejected Einstein's theories because of his Jewish heritage. In this world, relativity, quantum mechanics, and modern physics would never have developed. Suppression of free thought. Scientists who questioned Nazi beliefs would have been executed. Theories that challenged Hitler's worldview would be banned. Destruction of alternative energy. The Nazis relied heavily on fossil fuels. Renewable energy, environmental science, and sustainability would have been ignored. No independent inventions. In a world where all science served the state, there would be no garage inventors, no private innovation, no personal creativity. Only government-approved scientists would be allowed to work, and their research would serve only war and control. While some technologies would advance, many others would be lost forever. The world would remain stuck in a cycle of militarization, destruction, and oppression. In this alternate timeline, technology and science would not be tools of progress. They would be weapons of oppression. Every new discovery would be twisted into a tool of war, genocide, or surveillance. Humanity would not evolve. It would be engineered, controlled, and molded into a soulless machine designed only to serve the Nazi empire. But could anyone resist this technological nightmare? Could rebels use technology against the empire? The battle for freedom would be fought not just on the streets, but in the laboratories, in the digital world, and even in space. In Hitler's world, the economy would not exist to uplift people. It would exist to serve the empire. There would be no free market, no competition, and no chance for individuals to build wealth. The government would control everything: who works, who eats, and who lives in luxury. Society would be divided into a rigid hierarchy where only Aryans and high-ranking Nazi officials would prosper. The rest of the world would live in poverty, oppression, and forced labor. Let's explore what life would be like under Hitler's economic and social system. A government-controlled economy, no free market. Under Hitler's rule, capitalism and free enterprise would be eliminated. The economy would be entirely controlled by the Nazi state. The government owns everything. Factories, farms, banks, and businesses are under Nazi control. Private business does not exist. No personal wealth. Ordinary citizens do not own anything. The state decides who gets paid, how much, and what they can buy. Work assignments are forced. People cannot choose their jobs. The government assigns labor roles based on racial worth and loyalty to the Führer. No international trade. Hitler believed in economic self-sufficiency, autarky. The world would be isolated. Only Nazi-approved goods would be available. This economy would not reward talent or hard work. It would reward only one thing: obedience to Hitler's vision. Who benefits? Only the Aryans and the elite. The richest, most powerful people in this world would be Nazi leaders, military officials, and racially pure Aryans. Nazi leaders live in extreme luxury, while the majority of the world suffers. High-ranking Nazis enjoy enormous wealth, palaces, fine dining, and personal servants. Aryans receive privileged treatment. They get access to the best food, housing, education, and medical care, but only if they remain loyal to the Nazi empire. The rest of the world is considered inferior. If you are not Aryan, you are a worker, a servant, or worse, a disposable resource. No social mobility. A person born into the lower class will never be allowed to rise. The elite maintain total control. This system ensures that power remains in the hands of a few, while billions of people suffer under their rule. The working class, a life of slavery. For most people, life would be no different than being a slave. There would be no weekends, no wages, and no hope. Forced labor camps. Millions would be forced to work in Nazi factories, farms, and military bases under brutal conditions. 12 to 16-hour workdays. Workers would have no rights, no breaks, and no complaints. Food rations barely enough to survive. Workers would receive just enough food to keep them alive. Starvation would be common. Punishment for disobedience. If a worker spoke against the government, took a break, or made a mistake, they would be executed or sent to torture camps. Children forced to work. Education would only be for Aryans. Non-Aryan children would start working in factories as soon as they could walk. The working class would not be considered human. They would be seen as tools to build Hitler's empire. Wealth disparity. A society of extreme inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor would be unimaginable. The rich, Nazi leaders, and Aryan elite. Mansions, luxury cars, fine clothing. Imported food, private chefs, personal doctors. Exclusive entertainment parties and vacations in Nazi-only resorts. Servants and workers assigned to them. The poor, the rest of the world. Tiny, overcrowded apartments with no privacy. Only state-issued uniforms, no personal style. Surviving on basic rations of bread, soup, and water. No entertainment, no travel, no hope. The world would not be a place of opportunity. It would be a system designed to keep the powerful in power and the weak forever suffering. Black markets and underground resistance movements. Despite total government control, resistance would still exist. People desperate for survival would turn to underground markets and secret movements. The black market, a risky lifeline. With strict Nazi control, many essential goods would only be available illegally. Illegal trade of food, medicine, and technology. Secret radios broadcasting real news from hidden rebels. Fake identity papers to help people escape. However, buying or selling on the black market is punishable by death. The risk is enormous, but for many, it would be the only way to survive. The underground resistance, the fight against oppression. Even in Hitler's totalitarian world, some brave people would still resist. Secret schools. Teaching real history and science instead of Nazi propaganda. Hidden safe houses. Protecting those being hunted by the Nazi government. Sabotage missions. Brave individuals destroying Nazi weapons, hacking into propaganda systems and attacking high-ranking officials. Smuggling refugees. Helping non-Aryans escape to ungoverned territories. The Nazi Empire would try to crush the resistance at every turn. Anyone caught would be tortured, executed, or worse, used in human experiments. The future society, a world without freedom. Under Hitler's rule, the world would be trapped in a cycle of suffering. The rich stay rich, the poor stay poor. The government decides who eats, who works, and who lives. Ordinary people are nothing but slaves to the system. Freedom is a crime, and happiness is a fantasy. Would this system last forever? Could the black market and underground resistance movements eventually rise up against the Nazi Empire? The answer might surprise you. The world was in chaos. Adolf Hitler's rule had cast a dark shadow over Europe and beyond, tightening its grip on nations and crushing any form of opposition with brutal efficiency. Fear reigned supreme, and dissenters were hunted down like animals. Yet, in the face of unimaginable tyranny, a fire still burned, a fire of defiance, courage, and the unyielding belief that oppression could not last forever. Across the globe, underground rebellions were forming. Secret societies were mobilizing, and people were risking their lives to fight back against the most dangerous regime in modern history. But could they truly succeed? Was there any hope of overthrowing Hitler's iron-fisted rule? Underground rebellions across the world, from the ruins of occupied cities to the remote villages hidden deep within the mountains, resistance movements were emerging everywhere. These were not just small, disorganized groups. They were networks of brave individuals determined to sabotage, spy, and strike wherever possible. In France, the French resistance carried out daring acts of defiance, cutting off Nazi supply lines, distributing anti-Nazi propaganda, and providing intelligence to the Allies. Their efforts were crucial in undermining German control. In Poland, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, orchestrated some of the most sophisticated resistance efforts, launching sabotage missions, assassinating key Nazi officials, and even staging the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, a desperate attempt to reclaim their homeland. Though the uprising was brutally crushed, it demonstrated that even against overwhelming odds, people were willing to fight to the last breath. Beyond Europe, resistance movements were gaining momentum as well. In the Philippines, guerrilla fighters waged a relentless war against Japanese forces aligned with the Axis powers. In North Africa, resistance groups, backed by local tribes, engaged in skirmishes to weaken the Nazi-aligned Vichy government. Even in Germany itself, courageous individuals like the White Rose Movement, a student-led group, risked their lives to expose the horrors of the Nazi regime, distributing leaflets that called for an end to Hitler's rule. Secret societies fighting back. Resistance was not always visible. Some of the most effective fighters against the Nazis operated in the shadows, forming secret societies dedicated to undermining Hitler's war machine. These clandestine groups functioned under extreme secrecy, as exposure often meant immediate execution. One such group was Operation Valkyrie, a secret plot devised by high-ranking German officers who saw Hitler as a threat to their own country. Led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, the conspirators attempted to assassinate Hitler by placing a bomb in his conference room in July 1944. The explosion injured several top Nazi officials, but miraculously, Hitler survived. The failed attempt led to brutal reprisals, with thousands arrested and executed. Similarly, the Soviet partisans, a network of guerrilla fighters behind German lines, carried out deadly ambushes, derailed Nazi supply trains, and even assassinated key figures within Hitler's occupying forces. Their tactics, though ruthless, proved to be a major obstacle for the German war effort in the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Special Operations Executive SOE was secretly training and deploying agents across Europe to aid local resistance groups. These operatives, often working under false identities, carried out sabotage missions, trained local fighters, and gathered intelligence for the Allied forces. Many were captured and tortured, but their efforts significantly weakened Nazi control in occupied territories. How people secretly communicate and spread resistance. Under a dictatorship that relied on strict control of information, spreading resistance messages was one of the most difficult and dangerous tasks. The Nazis had established a vast surveillance network, intercepting communications and using informants to crush any sign of defiance. Yet, resistance fighters found ingenious ways to communicate. In occupied France, resistance members used radio transmissions to send coded messages to London. Phrases that seemed like ordinary sentences held hidden meanings. Specific words and numbers relayed instructions for sabotage missions or updates on enemy movements. These transmissions had to be brief and constantly changing in frequency to avoid Nazi detection. Printed materials also played a crucial role. Secret newspapers and pamphlets were produced in basements and distributed in the dead of night. The White Rose movement in Germany printed thousands of anti-Nazi leaflets, calling for civil disobedience and an end to Hitler's rule. Their work inspired many, though it ultimately cost them their lives when they were caught and executed. Resistance members also used more creative methods to pass information. Messages were hidden inside loaves of bread, sewn into clothing, or even written in invisible ink on ordinary-looking letters. In some cases, women would pass critical intelligence by weaving codes into their knitting patterns, something that Nazi soldiers would never suspect. The risks and sacrifices of those fighting against Hitler's rule. For those who dared to resist, the price of defiance was often death. The Nazi regime had zero tolerance for opposition, and its brutal security forces, the Gestapo and SS, hunted down rebels with ruthless efficiency. Anyone caught aiding the resistance faced torture, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. In Poland, resistance fighters often watched their families being executed as punishment for their actions. In the Netherlands, Anne Frank and her family lived in hiding for 2 years, only to be betrayed and sent to concentration camps. The White Rose movement's leaders, Hans and Sophie Scholl, were captured, interrogated, and executed by guillotine for distributing leaflets against the Nazis. Even high-ranking officials who turned against Hitler were not spared. Klaus von Stauffenberg and the other conspirators behind Operation Valkyrie were swiftly executed, their families persecuted. The message was clear. Anyone who opposed the Fuhrer would pay with their life. Yet, despite these dangers, people continued to resist. They refused to be silenced, even in the face of death. Their courage ensured that Hitler's vision of total domination would never fully materialize. The possibility of a revolution. Can Hitler's rule ever be overthrown? The question remained. Could Hitler truly be overthrown? The answer was not simple. On one hand, his grip on power was almost absolute. His security apparatus was one of the most ruthless in history, and his propaganda machine had brainwashed millions. But on the other hand, history had proven time and again that no dictatorship was invincible. As the war progressed, resistance efforts intensified. Sabotage missions increased. Morale within Hitler's ranks began to crumble, and the combined efforts of both underground movements and Allied forces weakened the Nazi war machine. By 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler's rule did not end because of a single resistance movement, but rather due to the relentless, collective efforts of countless brave individuals who never gave up hope. In the end, resistance was not just about overthrowing a tyrant. It was about proving that no amount of oppression could ever extinguish the human spirit. Though Hitler fell, the stories of those who fought back remain as a testament to the power of courage, unity, and resilience. The question was never just whether Hitler could be overthrown, but whether the world would stand against tyranny whenever it arose. And the resistance proved that the answer was always yes. The world stood at a crossroads. Adolf Hitler's rule had cast an unbreakable shadow over Europe and beyond, fueling a war that had claimed millions of lives. His empire, built on terror, oppression, and the ruthless extermination of those he deemed unworthy, seemed unshakable. The Nazi war machine had crushed nations, enslaved populations, and silenced opposition with brutality beyond imagination. Yet, history had always proven one thing: no empire lasted forever. The question remained, would Hitler's rule continue indefinitely, or was his downfall inevitable? And if the world were to rid itself of his ideology, would humanity ever truly recover? Would Hitler's rule last forever, or would the empire collapse? To the outside world, Hitler's control seemed absolute. His propaganda machine had molded German society into one that worshipped him like a god. His military, once the most feared in the world, had conquered vast territories, and his intelligence forces, led by the Gestapo and SS, ensured that no voice of dissent went unanswered. Every aspect of life in Nazi-occupied regions revolved around his vision, one of racial superiority, military dominance, and absolute control. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich was not just a fantasy in the minds of Nazi leaders. It was a carefully crafted blueprint meant to last for generations. But no empire, no matter how powerful, was invincible. The cracks in Hitler's regime had already begun to form, even at the height of his power. The war had stretched his forces thin, forcing Germany to fight on multiple fronts. The invasion of the Soviet Union had turned into a disaster, with Nazi troops suffering heavy losses against an enemy far more resilient than expected. Meanwhile, resistance movements were rising across Europe, sabotaging German operations, feeding intelligence to the Allies, and proving that the Nazi grip was not as unshakable as it seemed. Economic strain, internal dissent among his own officers, and the relentless pushback from the Allies all contributed to the slow but certain crumbling of Hitler's empire. The very ideology that built his power, one of extreme nationalism, racism, and authoritarianism, became his greatest weakness. As the war raged on, the question was not if Hitler's rule would end, but how. Possible scenarios for Hitler's downfall. There were several ways in which Hitler's rule could have come to an end, some more probable than others. Military defeat by the Allies. This was a scenario that ultimately unfolded. The combined forces of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain systematically dismantled the Nazi war machine, launching devastating offensives that pushed German forces back on all fronts. D-Day in 1944, the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front, and the relentless bombing campaigns over German cities ensured that Hitler's dream of global domination was shattered. By April 1945, Soviet troops had reached Berlin, and within days, Hitler's empire ceased to exist. Assassination from within. Many within Hitler's own ranks saw him as a liability, a madman leading Germany to destruction. Operation Valkyrie, the 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, was one of the most well-known attempts to remove him. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in Hitler's conference room, but the explosion failed to kill him. Had this or any other assassination attempt succeeded, Germany might have surrendered earlier, possibly preventing millions of deaths. Revolution by the German people. Though unlikely given Nazi control over society, there was a possibility that the German population, weary of war and suffering, could have risen against Hitler. The extent of Nazi propaganda and terror made this nearly impossible. But if Germany had suffered long enough under a failing regime, civil unrest and rebellion could have led to an internal overthrow, Hitler's own paranoia leading to collapse. As the war turned against him, Hitler became increasingly unstable. He purged officers, distrusted his own generals, and made erratic military decisions that only worsened Germany's position. Some historians argue that if Hitler had lived longer, his paranoia and mismanagement could have accelerated the downfall of the Nazi regime, causing it to collapse from within rather than through external military defeat. The cost of freedom. Would humanity ever recover? Even after Hitler was gone, the damage he had inflicted on the world was immeasurable. The war had claimed over 70 million lives, leaving entire cities in ruins, economies shattered, and families broken. The Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered, left an eternal scar on history. The question was not just whether humanity could move on, but how. The Nuremberg trials brought some of the worst Nazi war criminals to justice, yet many who had enforced Hitler's policies escaped punishment. The world had to grapple with the horrors of genocide, the consequences of blind nationalism, and the responsibility of ensuring such atrocities never happen again. The rebuilding process was slow, but determination prevailed. Countries that had once been enemies worked together to rebuild, and international organizations like the United Nations were formed to prevent another world war. However, the trauma did not disappear overnight. Survivors of the Holocaust, prisoners of war, and those who had lost everything to Hitler's ambitions faced lifetimes of pain and recovery. The war had shown the worst of humanity, and though Hitler was gone, the ideology he had spread did not vanish so easily. The greatest challenge was ensuring that Hitler's ideology did not survive beyond his death. While Nazi Germany had been destroyed, the hatred, racism, and authoritarianism that fueled it were not entirely eradicated. The world had to confront uncomfortable truths. How had such an evil ideology gained so much power? What had allowed people to be manipulated into committing atrocities? In the post-war years, efforts were made to educate future generations about the dangers of fascism. Memorials were built, history books documented the horrors of the Holocaust, and societies vowed to never allow such tyranny to rise again. Yet, even in modern times, extremist ideologies persist, proving that the fight against hate is never truly over. A future without Hitler's ideology meant creating a world where human rights, democracy, and equality were protected. The war had shown that silence and complicity allowed evil to thrive. The lesson was clear. The world could not afford to forget. Hitler's rule, despite its terrifying grip on the world, was destined to collapse. Whether through military defeat, assassination, or internal implosion, history had always shown that tyranny could not last forever. The cost of freedom, however, was immense. Millions had died, and the scars of war and genocide would linger for generations. Yet, the world had a chance to rebuild, to learn from the past, and to ensure that Hitler's ideology never rose again. The fight against tyranny did not end with his death. It was an ongoing battle that required vigilance, education, and a commitment to justice. Would humanity ever fully recover? Perhaps not. But the ultimate lesson of Hitler's downfall was that no matter how dark the times, there was always hope. And as long as people continued to stand against oppression, the future would never belong to tyrants. History is more than just a collection of events. It is a reflection of the choices made by individuals, societies, and leaders. The rise and fall of Adolf Hitler's empire was one of the darkest chapters in human history, a brutal reminder of what unchecked power, hatred, and blind obedience can lead to. Millions suffered, millions died, and the world was left scarred forever. But what if things had turned out differently? What if resistance had failed? What if the war had dragged on? Or worse, what if Hitler had won? Is this the world you would have wanted? Take a moment to reflect. Imagine living in a world where freedom was nothing but a distant memory, where people were ruled by fear, and where opposition was crushed before it could even take shape. Would you have accepted it? Would you have fought back? And if you had lived during that time, would you have had the courage to resist, knowing the risks? The value of freedom. Freedom is something many take for granted today, but history has shown that it is never guaranteed. It must be fought for, protected, and defended. The sacrifices of those who stood against Hitler's tyranny, from underground resistance fighters to ordinary citizens who refused to be silenced, remind us that oppression thrives when good people do nothing. Ask yourself, could such a future have been possible? What would the world look like today if Hitler's ideology had survived? Are there lessons from the past that we are still ignoring? History is not just about the past. It is about the future. Understanding what happened before helps us recognize the warning signs of tyranny, propaganda, and oppression in our own time. It challenges us to think critically, to question authority when necessary, and to stand up for what is right. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more thought-provoking alternate history scenarios. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and explore the countless what-ifs that history has left unanswered. Because the past is never truly gone. It shapes the world we live in today. Let's make sure we learn from it.